Hello, it's Scott Manley here. It's July 17th. It's time for another batch of Deep Space updates. And normally we would begin each episode with the rundown of all the orbital rocket launches that have happened in the last couple of weeks. But today we're going to start with a suborbital launch. In fact, some say it doesn't even go to space. I don't care. It's Virgin Galactic with VS01. That was their first flight with paying passengers, 3 members of the Italian Air Force, and a rack full of experiments. We got to see this. They were typically restrained in their reactions, But yeah, this flew. There looks like they're already getting set up for the second flight. I have a whole video on this vehicle and why I like it. Go and watch that. 1st of July, we had Falcon 9 taking Euclid into space. So this is a satellite for the European Space Agency. It's basically a spacecraft that's going to sit out at one of the Lagrange points with a 600 megapixel camera that works through the infrared and the visual, and it measures redshifts of galaxies all across the sky. And the whole point of this is to more accurately understand the expansion of the universe and maybe get some idea of what the heck is going on with dark matter and or dark energy. This spacecraft is interesting because it was originally supposed to launch on Soyuz, but when Soyuz no longer became an option, they moved it over to Falcon 9 because, of course, European Space Agency doesn't have many vehicles working right now. More on that later. It's also interesting that according to some sources, it's costing something like $1.5 billion to build this spacecraft. And that makes it the most expensive payload that we know that has flown on Falcon 9 to this point. Yeah, this thing is going to generate something like 30 petabytes of data per year. And, sending all that back from L1, it's going to be filling up a lot of hard disks. Anyway. And so yeah, on the 5th of July, we had Ariane 5, the final Ariane 5. And like many Ariane 5s before, it carried a pair of satellites to geostationary Earth orbit. There was a German satellite called Heinrich-Hertz and a French satellite called Syracuse 4B. These are both communication satellites that are going to sit up in GEO. And yeah, after this, there are no more Ariane 5s. We're waiting for Ariane 6, and it is not ready yet. And I also have a video about that. 7th of July, we had Falcon 9 taking off from Vandenberg with Starlink group 5-13, 48 satellites into a 43-degree orbit. Again, very low inclination orbit for Vandenberg. 9th of July, there was a Long March 2C from Jiuquan. And this was, again, kind of secret, but it sounds like this was carrying a satellite which was called Weixing Heliwang Zhishuxian, right, into 86.3 degree polar orbit at about 1,100 kilometers. Sounds like there was 2 satellites on board. Honestly, we don't know what this is, but apparently the translation of the name is Satellite Internet Technology Demonstration Satellite. So make of that what you will. 10th of July, Falcon 9 again, carrying Starlink Group 6-5. That means it's the a smaller number, 22 satellites that are V2 satellites, launching from Cape Canaveral. Again, normally Starlink launches have become sort of routine, but this one was special because it was using booster 1058. That's the one that he started back with NASA Demo Mission 2, right? It's the one that has the NASA logo on the side, or the worm logo anyway. This had last flown in December 2022, and then it spent almost 6 months sitting around testing because this is the 16th launch of that booster, and that means that this is now a life leader in terms of of SpaceX. So that's a big deal that they're now able to extend the capabilities of this booster. They've took it apart, they've checked it to make sure that it has been able to handle this. At some point, we might start hitting limits. But it looks like SpaceX haven't hit them yet. 12th of July, we had Zhuque-2, built by a company called Landspace. This is supposed to be a private corporation in China, and this launch is notable because it was the 500th launch to orbit by any Chinese rocket, apparently. But more importantly, This is the first rocket to go to orbit using methane and liquid oxygen as a propellant. So this is a fairly large rocket. It's like generates over 270 tons of thrust at launch. It can deliver like 6 tons to low Earth orbit, 4 if you're going to sun synchronous. So this is much bigger than all the other, Chinese small launch vehicle people that are just taking your solid rocket motors and slapping these together to make their own launchers. This is something where they've worked on a lot of their own development and engine design and built a modern vehicle that can compete in the world market. So, yeah, there had been something of a question, a race as to which company would manage to get the first methane-fueled rocket to orbit. Obviously, we had Starship from SpaceX and Vulcan by ULA. Those still haven't made it to orbit. And yeah, New Glenn in theory was a potential option, but yeah, it was never going to be winning in any race to do anything fast. So yeah, I guess that's a congratulations to Land Space for actually stepping over this hurdle and making this new step. Methane, it's the fuel that everyone wants to use, but it took a long time to figure out how to use it. 14th of July, we had, of course, in India, LVM3 carrying Chandrayaan-3, the mission that will go to the moon and hopefully finally land on softly and remain in one piece and actually talk back to the ground. Yes, it was great to see everyone in India turning up to watch this. It's super exciting. I hope that it gets to the surface and we actually have some excitement from the landing rather than more investigations as to what goes wrong. Again, I have a whole video on what happened about this. Finally, a few hours ago, we had another Starlink launch from Florida. And this is significant. It was the last launch of the Group 5. That means the final block of the 1.5 satellites. We're going to be going to version 2 satellites going forward. This was also the 16th launch of the booster number 1060. I think that started a couple of years ago as a transporter launch. Now, it then had spent like 6 months getting refurbished, verified that it was able to launch, and they actually had a problem on the initial launch attempt. They got down to T-40 and then had to call a hold. Subsequently, they performed an engine static fire, and 3 days later, a few hours ago, they successfully launched. And of course, successfully recovered the booster. And that means that in the last week, we've had 2 rockets pass the 16th launch and recovery. Okay, so now, rewinding, on June 28th, Ariane Space was testing the second stage of the Vega-C rocket. They've been trying to bring this back to flight after some previous failures that had been blamed on the second stage booster. During a 97-second planned burn of the second stage, they had a pressure loss at about 40 seconds in, indicating some sort of breach in the casing, which would obviously lead to a lost flight. So this means that Vega-C continues to remain grounded. This was big problem because they had previously traced the previous flight issues to problems with the throat that had eroded too quickly. But it looks like there are other issues with this second stage engine. So Vega-C is going to have to remain grounded. Maybe they will get it back to flight in 2024 now. And this means that between Ariane 6 not flying and Vega-C not flying and Soyuz not being available, Europe only have the original Vega rocket that is able to fly. So all these mission launch vehicles mean that the European Space Agency is moving many of its spacecraft over to Falcon 9. Later this year, we're going to get the Hera mission launching on a Falcon 9. This mission is going to go to the asteroid Didymos and Dimorphos. If you remember last year, the DART mission, Double Asteroid Redirect Test, slammed into Dimorphos and created this big cloud of debris. Hera is going to launch later this year, and it's going to visit that and see what it can learn, what might have changed, what new data we can acquire. And on the June 28th European Space Agency, while this Vega failure was happening again, they announced that they were going to move their Earth Aerosols Radiation Explorer, or EarthCare mission. That's been moved over to a Falcon 9. Now, originally, this had actually been moved off a Soyuz onto a Vega-C, but now Vega-C is no longer available. Falcon 9 is going to be the one, and that's probably going to launch sometime in the middle of 2024. Okay, so Elsewhere in the world, down at Boca Chica, lots has been going on down there, specifically the installation of what we like to call the Deluge system or the booster B-Day, right? If you remember the giant steel plate that Elon has talked about, well, they have been working the last couple of weeks, last few, I don't know, like 2 months actually, putting in big pilings, obviously had to clear everything out, breaking up a lot of the original tension in concrete, securing everything, putting in new, concrete, and finally they put down the big deluge plate underneath and they're just starting to connect up the various manifolds to it. This is supposed to blow the water straight up into the bottom of the booster during launch. I mean, there's some other stuff going on. For example, we saw a shot of Starship 25 from underneath from Elon. We know that it's Starship 25 because it still has the hydraulic power units and none of the subsequent ones are going to have that. Ship 25 is supposed to be the next one to fly. There's some other subtle changes in there, things that have been moved around, such as the COPVs are no longer visible. Booster 9 is looking like it's ready to roll out for testing. Booster, for proper fire testing. Booster 10 was moved down the road to the Massey Road test facility. And if you haven't been paying attention to Starbase, there's the construction site, there's the launch site, but there's also the Massey test site, which is a small chunk of land to the southwest sitting on the Rio Grande. And they've been doing some testing there. Anyway, moving onwards. Now, there is sad news for the Janus mission. This was going to be flying out to investigate asteroids, and it was going to be riding along as a secondary payload, a ride share, on the Psyche mission. Now, the problem with Psyche was that it was delayed by a year because of the software wasn't ready. It's going to launch this year, but it can't carry Janus anymore because it required that the trajectory pass close to Mars and get a gravity assist, and now the geometry for the gravity assist isn't going to work and they can't find any new destination. So Janus doesn't have a launch vehicle and it's been unable to find another launch opportunity within the budget that it has. It's a very low budget mission. So that means, unfortunately, that the hardware is going to go into a warehouse and it might get pulled out by a later team. It does happen. Famously, the Discover mission, which had been built in the 1990s, it was too strongly associated with Al Gore, and someone at NASA decided that it needed to go into storage as soon as George Bush became president. And when Obama came, it got pulled back out of storage and launched, and is still providing some amazing photos. Anyway, so that's not great for Janus. There's some really bad news for Viasat. If you remember, they launched Viasat 3 all the way to geostationary orbit using a Falcon Heavy, and they used that Falcon Heavy in expendable mode, sacrificing all those boosters. Viasat 3 has been trying to get itself running, and it is having a serious problem. Specifically, it looks like the giant reflector array is not deploying, and that is kind of critical to the spacecraft being able to perform its task. So this is like a fold-out piece of hardware which has been designed and built by Northrop Grumman. And yeah, it looks like it's not working. So there are actually 2 other Viasat 3 satellites that are prepared for future launches. And now this one doesn't look like it's going to be able to perform its mission. So it could well end up going to a graveyard orbit very early if they can't figure out how to solve this thing remotely. Because I don't think there's any way that you can solve this problem with the hardware that already exists. I believe the company's stock lost 20% of its value when this failure was found. Blue Origin had a bit of a setback when one of their BE-4 engines exploded during a post-production acceptance check. It exploded 10 seconds into it. This is probably some sort of manufacturing problem specific to this specific engine. Tory Bruno did have give a press conference or whatever to explain what the status is with the Vulcan, and he says that having a single engine like this come off the test stand and fail isn't such a big problem because their production rate of these BE-4 engines is high enough that it shouldn't set back future launches. They're actually aiming to launch to build 50 engines per year, so having one engine come out of acceptance and fail isn't a big problem, assuming that all the other ones work. Now, for Vulcan, they are still pushing to launch in 2023. The flight is expected now in Q4. You laid out a little more details on the failure of the Centaur on the test stand. what they found was that the leak originated on the forward dome of the tank, and it's made of very thin stainless steel to minimize the weight. And there's a door in this which they need for access. And what they did was they looked hard at the failure point, and they then reran a finite element analysis with more detailed mesh. And they found that when you've got an edge, you're going to have higher stresses. So they found that when you looked at it in more detail, it didn't quite work. There was a second issue where the welding that they've been using, the new laser welding technology for this Centaur, hasn't been as strong as anticipated, so they now have to build in a little more strength in other ways. And so this means they're going to have to add some reinforcement to the Centaur 5, and they're going to have to make changes to future ones. So it's going to add about 135 kilograms of mass to the Centaur. And they're probably going to be able to cut that down over time. But this 135 kilograms obviously comes out of Vulcan's payload until they fix that. But whatever, it looks like they've got that under control. Still hoping for a flight this year. Japan, they had an engine test failure. Again, this was the second stage of a rocket, their Epsilon S. So this was caught on camera, this failure. There was a bunch of people watching because they announced this thing. So the Epsilon S is sort of evolution of the Epsilons, where these are solid rocket motor based vehicles, dating way back to like the Lambda series. And they're expanding this capability a little. I think this engine was going to go from like 15 tons to 18 tons. And because it's a second stage engine, incidentally, they have to test this in a special vacuum chamber with a diffuser that what you do is you fire the rocket down this tunnel, and it sucks any air with it. So you evacuate this, and then the air can't get in, and you get vacuum performance for at least the important parts of the test. Unfortunately, yes, the engine exploded 56 seconds in, so that was going to delay updates to that. In the US, the House and Senate Appropriations Committee have drafted their bills for NASA funding, and that is going to give NASA less funding in 2024 than they got in 2023, as opposed to the higher levels of funding that had been requested by the Biden administration. This is part of government-wide cuts, except for the military, because, of course, trying to control spending, trying to control revenue. Yeah, this always happens. This means that, there's a lot of things that are going to get cut, aren't going to get the money they need. Of course, SLS is completely insulated and gets all the money it wants. Instead, science gets to lose everything. We get Dragonfly's not going to get what it wants. Mars Sample Return is getting told that it needs to control its costs. Veritas, we talked about Veritas a while back. They haven't got any of the money that they want. So this mission was awarded and then basically hasn't gone anywhere. Also, there's another important change for the US government funding is the National Security Space Launch Program is going to expand its heavy lift Lane 2 category to allow 3 companies to service. Now, who could that be? Well, if you remember a while back, there was the Omega from Northrop Grumman. That's probably not going to happen still, because that would have to come back. But New Glenn is still working, and it may well be in position to actually compete for these potential launches in the future. And finally, some good news from Mars. The Ingenuity helicopter is back in communications with Perseverance. A couple of months ago, it had moved to a new site, and they weren't 100% sure it would be able to communicate, and yet, unfortunately, it wasn't, just due to terrain. So Perseverance has since moved closer, moved to a higher ground, got line of sight. It is now able to talk to Ingenuity again, and Ingenuity is in good health. So we're expecting more flights from that, which is not bad for a vehicle that was expected to fly maybe 3 times if it wanted to complete its demonstration mission. So that's great news. I'm Scott Manley. Fly safe.